He found a silver briefcase washed ashore by the sea and, not suspecting what was inside, decided to take it home. But when he opened the lid, everything around him seemed to freeze. What he saw inside changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The morning after the storm arrived in a muted silver light. The wind that had howled through the night had died down to a low, steady sigh, and the air carried the heavy taste of salt and seaweed. Along the crescent of the beach, where the sand met the restless edge of the Atlantic, the world looked as if it had been turned inside out. Piles of kelp and tangled nets lay like the entrails of a great sea creature, and here and there, half-buried planks gleamed dark with moisture. The gulls had returned first, crying and circling, tearing at whatever the storm had cast up. Then came the people of the town, fishermen, scavengers, curious children, drawn down from their porches by the smell of wreckage and the promise of salvage. Among them moved Nathan Brooks, his boots sinking into the damp sand. The storm had kept him awake all night, each blast of wind drumming against his small house at the edge of the dunes. He had heard the rafters groan and had imagined his old boat, his only companion besides the sea, being torn from its moorings and smashed against the rocks. But when the dawn broke and he finally stepped outside, he saw that the little craft had survived, rocking wearily at the end of its rope like an old dog that had weathered another fight. The paint on her hull was blistered and the rope was frayed, but she still floated, and that was enough. Nathan was a large man, not tall but built solidly, his shoulders shaped by decades of pulling nets and lifting engines. His face was lined, darkened by sun and salt, his beard streaked with gray. The locals knew him as the man who never left the coast. He had been born here, had fished here all his life, and though the younger men sometimes laughed at his stubborn ways, they came to him when their engines failed or when the currents shifted and the fish disappeared. There was something steady about him, something of the tide itself, predictable, patient, unyielding. That morning he walked along the shoreline inspecting the aftermath. The sea had taken and given in equal measure. One neighbor's skiff had vanished completely, while another's crab traps lay scattered like broken ribs across the beach. A young couple from town were already filling a wheelbarrow with driftwood and bits of rope. Nathan nodded to them as he passed, his eyes scanning the horizon, drawn again and again to the dull shimmer where the surf rolled back and forth over the sand. The storm had been fierce, one of the worst in years, and the tide had climbed higher than anyone remembered. It had ripped open the dunes in places, exposing layers of wet clay and old roots. To Nathan, that meant the sea had secrets to reveal. Every storm did. Sometimes it was pieces of lost boats, sometimes the bones of a whale. Once, long ago, a storm had brought in a crate of old bottles that fetched good money at the market. You never knew. The air smelled of diesel and salt. His boots left deep prints that filled quickly with water. He moved carefully, scanning for anything worth saving. A good length of rope, a buoy, a piece of metal that could be useful. Around him, the town stirred to life. He could hear laughter somewhere down the beach, the scrape of a shovel against a crate, the steady thud of waves breaking. The sea had always been both giver and thief, and the people here had learned to live with that truth. But for Nathan, the ocean was something more intimate, almost personal. It had taken his son years ago, swallowed him whole on a calm afternoon when no one expected danger. Since then, Nathan had spoken less, smiled less, but he had never left the shore. He believed that the sea, in its own time, might one day give something back. He was thinking of his son that morning when he noticed the glint of metal. It caught his eye from far down the beach, a flash of silver where everything else was dull gray and brown. At first, he thought it was a can or a piece of hull plating, but as he drew closer, he saw that it was rectangular, half buried in sand, the edges softened by salt, but still unmistakably man-made. He crouched, brushing away the wet grit with his thick fingers. The object was a case, a suitcase or something like it, made of brushed aluminum, the kind that once might have belonged to a pilot or a businessman. 2 latches, both corroded but intact, gleamed faintly beneath a crust of salt. No name tag. No markings except a small series of numbers engraved near the handle. 486M. Nathan glanced around. No one else seemed to have noticed it. A few of the younger fishermen were farther down the beach, arguing over a broken engine cowling. The rest were busy scavenging near the dunes. The case was lodged deep, the tide having pushed it into the sand with force. He dug his hands around it, feeling the cold metal against his palms. It was heavier than it looked, much heavier. Whatever was inside wasn't water or sand. It was solid, dense. He straightened up, the weight of it pulling on his arms, and for a moment he just stood there, the wind tugging at his jacket, staring at the thing. It was the kind of item that carried stories. He could feel it. He carried it to his boat, setting it carefully under a folded net. The sound of metal against wood made him wince. It felt wrong to treat it roughly. When he looked back toward the water, the tide was already advancing again, washing over the spot where he'd found it. A minute later, the silver was gone, replaced by the restless gleam of the returning sea. Nathan felt a strange satisfaction, as though he'd stolen something from the ocean before it could change its mind. The sky began to clear in slow streaks of pale blue. He decided to head home before the next squall. Pushing the small boat off the sand took effort. His shoulders burned, and the muscles in his arms trembled with strain. Once afloat, he started the outboard, the old motor coughing and sputtering before catching with its familiar, uneven rhythm. The waves were still high, but not dangerous. He steered toward the inlet, where the narrow channel wound between the rocks and led to the quiet lagoon beyond. From there it was only a short distance to his shack. As he moved through the channel, he could see the town behind him. Small houses with tin roofs, their paint bleached by sun and salt, smoke rising from a few chimneys. The place always looked half forgotten after a storm, as if it existed outside time. Nathan had never imagined living anywhere else. The idea of cities, of offices and crowds had always made him uneasy. The sea, for all its moods, was honest. It took what it wanted, gave what it chose, and asked for nothing but respect. By the time he reached the lagoon, the sky had turned a clean, hard blue. The case lay at his feet, dull now without the sand's reflection, streaked with salt like frost. He felt the urge to open it, to see what secrets it held, but he pushed the thought away. He would wait. Things found at sea carried their own kind of danger. Sometimes they belonged to someone who would come looking. Sometimes they brought trouble. He had learned that lesson many years ago, when a crate of whiskey had washed ashore and half the town had nearly come to blows over it. Curiosity was a luxury he couldn't afford until he understood what he was dealing with. The boat scraped against the dock beside his house, a narrow structure of warped boards and old tires. He tied the line, lifted the case again, and carried it up the short path that led to his door. The shack was small but sturdy, built by his father and patched 100 times over. Inside, the air was dry and smelled of rope and coffee. He placed the case on the table and stood looking at it for a long moment. A bead of seawater slid down one corner, leaving a dark trail on the wood. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere distant, a buoy bell clanged lazily. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and sat by the window. The light shifted slowly through the day. He could hear voices from the beach now and then, laughter carried by the wind, but they felt far away. The case seemed to draw all the attention in the room, as if it had a gravity of its own. He reached out once, ran a finger over the surface, and felt the chill of the metal. It was the same cold he remembered from the mornings when he'd gone diving with his son. The shock of the first plunge, the way the ocean swallowed the warmth of your skin. He pulled his hand back. Evening came early. The horizon glowed briefly and then dimmed to violet, and the sound of the sea grew louder as the wind changed. Nathan lit a lamp and checked the locks on the door. Old habits. He told himself he would bring the case to the authorities in the morning, maybe ask around the harbor if anyone had lost cargo. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't. Not yet. Something in him wanted to understand what it was first. The idea of letting someone else open it felt wrong, like handing over a story before you'd read the first page. He moved the case to a corner of the room and covered it with a folded tarp. Then he sat back at the table, staring at the flickering lamplight on the wall. The rhythm of the waves outside was steady, hypnotic. He thought again of the night's storm, of how easily the sea could have taken him too. Perhaps this was a kind of offering, a small repayment from the ocean that had taken so much. Perhaps, he told himself, it was nothing more than junk washed in from a wreck. But the thought did not calm him. He could feel, somewhere beneath his ribs, a faint unease growing, like the pressure that builds before the next wave. When he finally rose to go to bed, he hesitated by the covered shape in the corner. The lamp threw a dull reflection across the tarp, a faint metallic gleam beneath the folds. For a moment, he thought he heard a sound, just a tiny click like metal settling. He held his breath, listening. Nothing. Only the soft moan of the wind along the walls. He shook his head and turned away, but as he reached for the lamp, he couldn't help glancing back once more. The case sat silent and immovable, but he could not shake the sense that it was waiting for something. Outside, the tide began to rise again, whispering across the sand. The beach was empty now, the last lanterns from the town flickering out. The world was quiet except for the sea, and in that quiet, Nathan Brooks lay awake long into the night, listening to the steady pulse of the waves, and wondering what he had brought home from the deep. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying with it the damp scent of the receding tide and the faint tang of rot from the seaweed that now carpeted the beach. Nathan woke before dawn, as he always did, the habit of years at sea still governing his body even when there was no reason to rise so early. His small bedroom was filled with a blue-gray light that leaked in through the cracks around the shutters, and for a moment he lay still, listening. The storm had left behind a new kind of silence, heavy and hollow, broken only by the distant, steady breathing of the ocean. But beneath that rhythm, there was something else, something that prickled the back of his neck, a subtle, metallic echo in the room beyond. He swung his legs off the bed, the floorboards cold under his feet, and stared through the open doorway into the kitchen. The tarp he had thrown over the silver case still covered it, a shapeless lump in the corner. The lamplight from last night had long since gone out, and the dim glow of morning made the shape seem both smaller and somehow more ominous. He rubbed his eyes, muttering under his breath, and reached for the kettle. Coffee first, then decisions. Always coffee first. The flame from the stove sputtered and hissed. The pot began to murmur. Nathan poured the steaming black liquid into a chipped mug, breathing in the bitterness, letting the warmth steady him. He tried to push away the thoughts that had haunted him half the night. The weight of the case, the chill of its surface, the way it had seemed to pulse faintly in the dark. He told himself it was just his imagination. But when the house creaked under a gust of wind, he found himself glancing toward it again. The sea had taught him long ago that anything pulled from its depths carried a story, and not all stories were kind. Men who brought up barrels of rum, crates of tools, or even bundles of fishing nets often found themselves the owners of other people's mistakes. Cargo was never just cargo. It belonged to someone, and someone might come looking. Yet curiosity had its own pull. Nathan had spent a lifetime reading the ocean, and he could feel it even now, that quiet pressure of something unresolved, something wanting to be known. He stood, walked to the corner, and pulled away the tarp. The case gleamed faintly in the half-light, thin trails of dried salt still etched across its sides. He crouched, running his fingers along the latches. The corrosion wasn't bad. The sea hadn't had time to eat into the metal. It would open if he really wanted it to. His reflection looked back at him from the brush surface, warped, dark, ghost-like. He fetched his fishing knife from the table and wedged the tip beneath one latch. The sound it made, a low, scraping pop, cut through the quiet room. One lock gave way easily, the metal springing open with a dull click. The second latch resisted. He pressed harder, the knife handle biting into his palm, until with a sudden crack it snapped loose. A thin hiss escaped as the pressure seal broke, and for a second the smell of salt water and rust filled the air. Inside, under a layer of plastic wrapping, were tightly sealed packets, thick, rectangular, and pale green in color. Money. Nathan blinked, uncertain if his eyes were playing tricks. Each packet was wrapped in transparent film, the bills neatly aligned, banded with faded paper strips stamped with serial codes and dates. They weren't new. The edges of the bills had darkened slightly with age, and the ink had lost its sheen. His hands, rough from years of labor, trembled slightly as he lifted one bundle. The paper inside was dry. He set it down carefully and peered deeper into the case. Beneath the layers of currency lay a smaller metal box, darker in color, its edges rubber-sealed and its lid locked by a small digital keypad. The screen was blank, dead from time or water. A faint engraving ran along the side, letters too worn to read, but he could make out a few. Gry 86. It looked military or perhaps industrial. Whatever it was, it did not belong on a small-town fisherman's table. Nathan leaned back in his chair and stared at it all. The bundles, the box, the sheer impossibility of it. He felt a strange heat behind his ribs, part fear, part wonder. In all his years walking these beaches, he'd never found anything like this. Driftwood, wreckage, bits of junk, those were common enough, but this was something that could change everything. The thought unsettled him. He had never wanted change. His life was simple, maybe too simple, but it was his. The ocean gave what he needed, no more, no less. He paid his bills, kept his nets mended, and minded his own business. But now, here on his kitchen table, lay enough money to buy every boat in the harbor, maybe even the harbor itself. He took a long sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding him again. He thought of what he could do with the money, pay off the debts on his father's old boat, fix the roof that leaked every winter, maybe even rebuild the house that had belonged to his mother. But almost as soon as the thought formed, another followed, the one that reminded him that nothing found in the sea came without a price. The small metal box caught his attention again. He touched the keypad with a calloused fingertip. The surface was cool, almost icy. He imagined what might be inside: documents, jewelry, maybe even something dangerous. The word military kept circling in his mind. He'd seen enough naval debris wash ashore over the years to recognize that dull, gray finish. The marking GRY 86 might have been an identification code. Or maybe it was just coincidence. He tried to lift the case. It was still heavy, even with some of the money removed. The weight wasn't only physical, it carried something else, a presence. The air in the small room felt thicker now, and he noticed his own breathing had slowed. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters again, and the familiar cry of gulls broke the spell. Nathan exhaled, repacked the bundles, and closed the lid. The latches snapped shut with a sharp metallic bite. He stared at it for a while longer, then rose and carried it to the back of the room. The small storage closet, barely large enough for a set of nets and a few tools, would do. He shoved aside an old tackle box, set the case on the floor, and covered it with a spare tarp. Then he turned the key in the lock and pocketed it. The act should have brought relief, but it didn't. He went outside, needing air. The world had changed in the few hours since dawn. The sky had cleared. The sea was calm again, and sunlight was spilling across the dunes, glinting off the wet sand like glass. From where he stood, he could see people down the beach, combing through debris. Children ran with sticks, chasing gulls. The town was waking up, and yet Nathan felt detached from it all, as if he stood on the edge of something invisible and immense. He walked to the shoreline, the sand warm now beneath his boots, and stared out at the horizon. The sea looked innocent, almost lazy, its surface glittering as if nothing had happened the night before. But Nathan knew better. The ocean never forgot what it took. The storm had carried off half of Old Man Dalton's pier, had snapped trees along the coast, had left boats stranded and roofs torn open. It had buried and uncovered things indiscriminately, like a restless god rearranging its offerings. The silver case was just one of its gifts. He crouched near the waterline, picking up a piece of driftwood. The wood was smooth, polished by years of rolling in the surf and marked by strange scars, tiny grooves cut by barnacles. He turned it over in his hands, thinking. Once, when his boy was small, they had walked this same stretch of beach after a summer storm. His son had been fascinated by the shapes of driftwood, the odd patterns that nature left behind. The sea's handwriting, he had called it. Nathan smiled faintly at the memory, but it faded quickly. He tossed the stick back into the waves and watched it drift away. When he returned to the house, the light had changed again. Clouds were gathering over the water. Not another storm, not yet, but a warning that the calm would not last. The smell of salt was stronger. Nathan lit the lamp on the table and sat for a long time without moving. The case was out of sight now, but its presence lingered. Every creak of the house seemed sharper, every gust of wind heavier. He tried to distract himself with small tasks, repairing a frayed net, sorting his hooks, checking the fuel canisters for his boat. But no matter what he did, his thoughts circled back to that dull metallic weight in the closet. He imagined it glowing faintly in the dark, waiting for him. He imagined footsteps in the sand outside, someone watching his house, waiting too. As the evening deepened, he poured himself a second cup of coffee, then a third. He told himself again that he would go to the police in the morning. It would be the smart thing to do. But the memory of their lazy, indifferent faces, the way they brushed off the concerns of men like him, filled him with doubt. He knew how things worked in small towns. If the case was worth money, it would vanish into someone else's hands long before the paperwork was filed. The lamp flickered. Nathan rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of sleeplessness pressing in. He stood and went to check the door. The lock was firm, but when he looked down, he noticed something strange in the sand just beyond the threshold, a faint footprint. It could have been his own, left earlier when he fetched firewood, but the angle seemed wrong. He bent down, tracing it with his finger. The edges were still sharp, not softened by the wind. Whoever had made it had done so recently. A cold shiver ran through him. He straightened, scanning the darkness beyond the porch. Nothing moved. The beach stretched empty toward the line of the dunes. He listened, the waves, the wind, the creak of the wooden beams. That was all. Still, he left the light burning as he stepped back inside. He checked the closet once more. The tarp was undisturbed, the lock intact. He touched it briefly, then turned away. There was no sense in torturing himself further tonight. He would decide what to do in the morning. But when he finally lay down, sleep did not come easily. The sound of the surf filled the small room, rhythmic and endless. Every so often he thought he heard something else, a faint metallic tick, like a heartbeat echoing from the other side of the wall. He told himself it was the pipes or the wind. He told himself a lot of things before exhaustion finally pulled him under. Outside, the tide crept closer again, whispering against the shore. In the distance, the clouds thickened and began to swallow the stars. And, in the quiet of the fisherman's shack, the silver case waited patiently, heavy with its secrets, while the sea, unseen beyond the dunes, began to stir once more. The following morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that seemed to have lost its direction. Nathan rose later than usual, his head thick with restless dreams he couldn't remember clearly. When he looked out the window, the sea was flat and metallic, like a sheet of dull pewter stretching to the horizon. The air felt charged, expectant. Even the gulls were quieter, circling lazily above the harbor, their cries muted by the humidity. He washed his face in the small basin near the stove, the cold water waking him sharply, and for a moment he stood still, dripping, his eyes fixed on the closed door of the storage closet. Behind it, silent and hidden beneath a tarp, the silver case waited. He poured a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and thought about what to do. All through the night, the memory of the footprint by the door had gnawed at him. Someone had been close, too close. The mark had been deep, deliberate, not just a passerby. The realization that someone else might know about the case filled him with unease. Maybe they had followed the same stretch of beach, seen the same flash of metal buried in the sand, but arrived too late. Maybe they had been searching for it long before he stumbled upon it. He took a slow sip of the bitter liquid and stared out toward the line of boats in the harbor. The calm on the surface of the day didn't fool him. Trouble often came quietly, dressed as routine. By mid-morning, he decided he needed to talk to someone who might remember things. Not the authorities, not anyone who would ask questions he wasn't ready to answer, but someone who had seen enough of the sea to recognize its patterns. That meant Salt. Old Salt, as everyone called him, had been a sailor all his life. No one knew his real name anymore, and no one needed to. He had retired years ago, but still came down to the docks every morning, sitting on an upturned crate beside the fuel shed, rolling cigarettes with his thick, yellowed fingers, and telling stories to anyone who'd listen. He'd served on cargo ships, tugboats, trawlers, anything that floated and paid enough to feed him. Nathan respected him because the sea respected him. Salt knew its moods better than most priests knew their prayers. Nathan left the shack locked, the key in his pocket, and made his way down the narrow sand path to the harbor. The walk took 10 minutes, past weathered cottages and sheds patched with tin, past the old general store with its faded sign and the rusted pickup that had sat unmoved in front of it for years. The streets were mostly empty. A few men were working on their boats, hammering, swearing, pausing to wipe sweat from their faces. Everyone nodded to Nathan in passing, but no one asked questions. He found Salt where he expected him to be, perched on his crate with a cigarette dangling from his lips, the smoke curling around his beard like mist. His eyes were sharp despite his age, small and blue like bits of broken glass. "Morning," Nathan said quietly. Salt grunted in acknowledgement, flicking ash into a can by his foot. "You're late today." "Didn't sleep much." "Storm'll do that to you," Salt said. "Always does." He squinted at the horizon. "Calm now, though. The sea's got that dead look. Means she's thinking about something." Nathan stood beside him, watching the slow movement of the water against the pilings. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them was easy, the silence of men who understood each other without needing words. Finally, Nathan said, "You remember that cargo ship that went down back in the 80s? The one folks used to talk about? Out near the reef?" Salt turned his head slightly. "You mean the Myron?" "Yeah, I remember." He tapped ash again, his eyes narrowing. "What about it?" Nathan hesitated. "They ever find any of it?" "Not much," Salt said after a pause. "Bits and pieces, most of it scattered or buried deep. She went down fast, they said. Rumor was she was carrying something important. Bank shipment, paper, gold, I don't know. Half the crew was never found." Nathan nodded slowly, trying to keep his tone casual. "You ever hear the name Grayson?" Salt frowned, thinking. "Grayson? Yeah. Lieutenant Grayson, Navy man, was on board the Myron as an observer, some government thing. My brother knew a diver who went out looking after the wreck. Said they found a few personal effects near the reef, but nothing official. Why do you ask?" Nathan looked away, pretending to study the horizon. "Just something I heard. Thought it might be connected to some of the junk washing up lately." Salt chuckled softly. "Junk, huh? Sometimes it's not junk, boy. Sometimes the sea throws things back when it's had enough of them. You find something?" The question hung between them like a hook. Nathan forced a small shrug. "Just some old gear, part of a crate. Nothing worth keeping." Salt nodded, but Nathan could tell the old man didn't believe him. He could feel those glass-blue eyes on him, weighing his words. After a moment, Salt said, "Careful what you drag home from the water. Some things are better left where they belong." "I know," Nathan said. He stayed a while longer, listening as Salt drifted into another story about a freighter caught in a typhoon near the Caribbean. But Nathan's thoughts had already moved elsewhere. As he turned to leave, he noticed a dark SUV parked farther down the dock, half in shadow. Two men stood near it, one smoking, the other pretending to look at the gulls. The same type of men who didn't belong in a fishing town, their clothes too clean, their posture too stiff. The smoker lifted his camera and snapped a photo toward the harbor, the lens glinting briefly in the sunlight. Nathan's stomach tightened. He kept walking, not breaking stride, but he felt the weight of their eyes following him as he passed the fuel shed and rounded the corner toward the main street. The sense of being watched, which had haunted him since he'd found the footprint by his door, returned now with renewed force. Whoever they weren't tourists. Tourists didn't come here in the off-season, and they didn't carry cameras that expensive. By the time he reached his shack, the sky had turned the color of lead. He locked the door behind him and went straight to the closet. The lock was untouched, the tarp still in place, but he felt no relief. He pulled the case out, brushing dust from its surface. For the first time, he noticed something he hadn't before. Faint letters etched near the corner, barely visible under the layer of salt. R. Grayson. He sat heavily on the chair, staring at the name. The world outside his window seemed to fade away, leaving only the soft whisper of the tide. The name connected too neatly to the story Salt had told him. The lieutenant who vanished with the Myron. The timing fit. The serial numbers on the money bands, the military-style lockbox, all of it pointed in the same direction. The case in his possession wasn't some lost tourist luggage. It was part of something buried in the sea for decades, something that people, maybe dangerous people, still wanted back. He turned the name over in his mind. R. Grayson. He wondered what kind of man he had been, what had driven him to sea on that doomed voyage. Duty? Greed? Desperation? Nathan didn't know, but he could feel the echo of that decision in his own. The case had crossed years and tides to reach him. The thought filled him with both dread and awe. He spent the rest of the afternoon pacing. The temptation to open the inner metal box gnawed at him. If the name belonged to its owner, maybe it contained something personal. Identification, records, a message. But the keypad lock was a problem. It was dead, and without power or the code, it might as well have been welded shut. He examined it carefully, noting the faint wear on two of the keys. People were creatures of habit. The numbers most pressed were often part of a code, but guessing would take time and each mistake could trigger a lockout. By dusk, the light in the room had dimmed to amber. He decided to try charging the device. Digging through a drawer, he found a small battery pack he used for his radio, stripped the wires, and carefully attached them to the contacts. A faint hum answered him. The display flickered to life, showing 6 blank digits waiting to be filled. His pulse quickened. He pressed the first few numbers that came to mind. Combinations of dates, patterns, nothing. Each failed attempt reset the screen with a soft electronic click. Finally, he stopped, wiping sweat from his forehead. He needed more information. He went to his old laptop, a relic he barely used anymore, and powered it on. The connection was slow, the screen flickering, but it worked. He typed the name into the search bar, Lieutenant R. Grayson, 1986 Myron. After a long pause, a few results appeared, mostly old newspaper clippings, reports of the disappearance, speculation about smuggling, and a brief mention of an investigation that had been closed due to lack of evidence. There was a photograph, too, grainy and small, but clear enough. A man in uniform, smiling stiffly beside a cargo vessel. He couldn't have been more than 30. Nathan stared at the image for a long time, then closed the laptop. The weight of what he was holding settled over him like the thick, humid air outside. Somewhere, decades ago, this man had vanished with his ship and his secrets. And now, through the slow and merciless movement of the tides, a piece of that story had come ashore in Nathan's hands. Outside, he heard the low growl of an engine. He froze, his heart thudding. The sound grew louder, then faded as the vehicle passed by his shack and stopped somewhere near the dunes. He moved to the window and peered out. Headlights flashed once, briefly, before shutting off. Then silence. The night deepened. The only sounds were the steady rush of the surf and the creak of his house in the wind. Nathan locked the case again and slid it under the bed this time, closer to him. He left the lamp burning as he lay down. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of water and steel, of voices calling through static. In the last moments before dawn, he thought he heard something outside again. Footsteps in the sand. Careful, deliberate. But when he rose to check, opening the door to the cold gray light of early morning, the beach was empty. Only the gulls wheeled above, and the footprints that led to the dunes were already fading under the wind. Nathan stood there for a long time, the ocean stretching before him like an unfinished sentence, the name Grayson echoing in his mind. Somewhere behind that horizon lay the wreck of the Myron, and the rest of the story he had now become a part of. And somewhere inland, unseen, the men in the dark SUV were watching, waiting for their chance to reclaim what the sea had reluctantly given up. The morning broke with a thin, colorless light that seemed to drain the world of warmth. Nathan woke to the sound of the waves gnawing at the shore and the faint creak of his house shifting under the wind. He lay there for a moment, listening, waiting for the uneasy quiet that followed to tell him if anyone was outside. But there was nothing except the dull thud of the sea and the restless tapping of loose boards against the wall. The memories of the night before clung to him. The headlights near the dunes, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps fading into the sand. The image had stayed in his mind like a bruise. Someone had been there. Of that he was sure. Someone who knew exactly where to look. He rose and went through the familiar motions of lighting the stove and boiling water for coffee, though his movements were slower, more deliberate. His eyes flicked constantly toward the window. Beyond the thin glass, the beach stretched empty and pale. The tide had retreated, leaving long wet streaks where the surf had clawed at the sand. Everything looked calm, but Nathan had learned long ago that calm was a liar. After breakfast, he decided to check the shoreline again. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. The sea was restless, and when men came looking for what it had hidden, they left traces, just like storms did. He stepped outside, his boots sinking slightly into the damp sand, the morning air sharp and cold against his face. The wind carried the scent of brine and seaweed, mixed with the faint, oily tang of fuel from the harbor. He scanned the dunes first. Nothing. The marks from last night's tires were still faintly visible near the ridge, half erased by the breeze. Someone had indeed driven there, stopped for a while, and then gone. He followed the faint ruts with his eyes until they disappeared into the scrub. Whoever it was, they had been careful. But they hadn't counted on the fisherman's eyes. He had spent a lifetime reading the sea, learning to spot the slightest shift in current or color, the kind of attention that could make the difference between a full net and an empty one, or between life and death when the weather turned. He knelt and touched the sand. It was cold and smooth where the tires had pressed deep. The tracks were fresh. He stood again, his jaw tightening. Back inside, the house felt smaller than before, as if the walls were closing in. The case under his bed was more than an object now. It was a presence. He could feel it even when he wasn't looking at it, as though it breathed with its own rhythm. He sat at the table, the old wooden chair creaking under his weight, and rubbed his temples. He needed to know what was inside the metal lockbox. The name Grayson haunted him. If he could understand what the man had been carrying, maybe he could understand why strangers were suddenly prowling around his property. He waited until the sun had climbed higher, then went to his tool shed. From an old drawer, he took a few small pieces of wire, an old battery, and a pair of pliers. He'd worked with enough electronics on his boat radios to know a little about circuits. Maybe it would be enough. The thought of tampering with something that might belong to the government, or worse, made his stomach tighten, but ignorance was worse. Ignorance could get him killed. Back inside, he cleared the table and set the lockbox down. The keypad's surface was scratched and dull, the small screen lifeless. He connected the wires to the contacts, adjusting the current from the battery until a faint spark flickered. Then the screen came to life, glowing a weak green. 6 digits blinked across it, waiting for an answer. He studied the buttons, the faint smudges of oil and wear. 2 of them, 3 and 8, had more shine than the others. People often reused familiar combinations, birthdays, years. The ship Myron had gone down in 1986. He tried 038686. Nothing. Then 863086. Again, nothing. He sat back, exhaling slowly. The lock reset, the faint hum dying. He needed a clearer head. Standing, he crossed to the window for air. Outside, the light had changed, the sky darker now, streaked with high clouds. Down by the beach, he saw a figure near the line of rocks. It was too far to make out details, just a dark silhouette bending as if searching through the sand. Another scavenger, maybe. But something about the stillness of the movement bothered him. He stood there, watching. The figure straightened, turned toward his house, and for a heartbeat Nathan thought their eyes met, even at that distance. Then the person moved away, walking along the water's edge, and disappeared behind a dune. He waited a long time before sitting back down. The hum of the lockbox still hung in the air. He forced himself to focus. Maybe there was another way to open it. He remembered a trick a mechanic had shown him years ago. Certain digital locks stored emergency override codes in the circuitry. If he could trip the right connection, it might bypass the keypad altogether. He pried open the back panel with his knife, careful not to break the wiring. Inside, there was a small circuit board coated with salt corrosion. He cleaned it gently with a piece of cloth and exposed 2 tiny copper pins. When he bridged them with the wire, the lock clicked softly. Nathan froze. Then, with a careful breath, he lifted the lid. Inside was a flash drive sealed in plastic, a strip of photographic negatives, and a thin sheaf of waterproof paper. The air that escaped smelled faintly of rust and oil, as if it had been sealed in another world. The negatives, when he held them up to the light, showed grainy images of a ship's deck, containers stacked in rows, a few blurred figures in uniform. The writing on the edge of the film read Myron, July 1986. He spread the papers on the table. They were lists, serial numbers, cargo manifests, and names written in tight, slanted handwriting. Some of the items were marked restricted, others classified. At the top of one page was a header that made his skin crawl. Department of Naval Procurement, Shipment, 47A. He leaned back, trying to steady his breathing. So it was true. The Myron hadn't just been a cargo ship carrying banknotes or ordinary goods. It had been a government vessel, and whatever it had been carrying wasn't meant for public eyes. If that was the case, then the men watching him weren't just thieves. They were cleanup. They were the kind who made sure lost things stayed lost. A gust of wind slammed the shutters against the wall, making him jump. He gathered the papers quickly, returning them to the box. The flash drive he slipped into his pocket. He had an old laptop that still worked well enough for basic use. Maybe he could see what was on it. The storm outside grew louder as clouds rolled in from the west. He turned on the laptop, connected the drive, and waited. The machine whirred and clicked, struggling under the weight of age. Finally, a folder appeared on the screen. Manifest RG. Inside were a handful of files labeled with numbers and dates. He opened one at random. The screen filled with columns of data, coordinates, shipment details, and cryptic notes. But one line caught his eye. Cargo compromised. Directive to divert shipment pending authorization. Another file contained short video fragments. The grainy footage showed men in rain-slick jackets working on deck at night, their faces ghostly in the floodlights. Voices shouted over the roar of wind. "Keep the containers sealed. No one touches the restricted section." The camera jolted as lightning flashed. Then the image froze on a blurred shape in the corner, something like a stenciled logo on a container door. Nathan squinted. The letters RDC 47 were faint but clear. He didn't understand everything he was seeing, but one thing was certain. This was evidence of something big, something that had been buried for decades. He imagined what would happen if this information reached the wrong hands, or even the right ones. Maybe Grayson had tried to expose something and died for it. Maybe this was what the men in the SUV were looking for. A sound at the window snapped him back. He turned sharply. For a second, he thought he saw movement, a shadow crossing the glass. Then it was gone. His heart pounded. He shut the laptop, pulled the flash drive free, and slipped it into his boot. He moved to the door, every muscle tense. The handle was cold under his fingers. He waited, listening. The only sound was the wind. Then, faintly, the crunch of footsteps in the sand. He stepped outside, eyes scanning the fading light. The dunes were empty again, but he knew someone was there. The instinct that had saved him in storms told him so. He backed toward the house and bolted the door. The wind rose, rattling the windows. The first drops of rain began to fall, slow and heavy. He turned off the light and stood in the dark, letting his eyes adjust. Through the crack in the curtain, he watched the beach. Lightning flashed far out at sea, illuminating the dunes in a stuttered burst of white. For an instant, he saw them. Two figures standing near the edge of the beach, motionless, facing the house. He stayed there long after they were gone, until the rain thickened and the beach vanished behind a curtain of water. When he finally moved again, his legs ached from standing. He checked the back door, then the window locks. Every creak in the wood made him start. Near midnight, when the wind howled hardest, he left the safety of the house and made his way to the old boathouse farther down the beach. The building had been abandoned for years, its roof sagging, its boards warped and gray. He pried open the door and stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. He found a space beneath a pile of tarps where he could hide the case, wrapping it in canvas and securing it under an overturned dinghy. No one came here anymore. It would be safe, at least for a while. When he returned to the shack, soaked and shivering, he sat at the table and stared at the dark window. He thought of the names on the manifest, of the cargo marked restricted, of the frightened voices on the video. It all felt too big for him. He was just a fisherman, a man who wanted nothing more than to live out his days quietly by the water. But the sea had chosen him for something else. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was punishment. He dried his hands, poured a small measure of rum into his coffee, and drank it slowly. The warmth did little to steady him. Outside, thunder rolled, low and distant. The flash drive pressed against his ankle inside his boot like a reminder of the choice he had yet to make. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would decide. He would either go to the authorities or destroy it all. But as the wind screamed around the house and the rain beat against the roof, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever decision he made, he was already too deep. The moment he had pried that case from the sand, his life had changed course, and there was no turning it back. The storm roared on into the night, swallowing the sound of the waves, the voices of the town, the whisper of the past that had come crawling out of the sea. And Nathan, alone in his small house, sat in the flickering lamplight, watching the darkness through the glass, knowing that the eyes out there were still watching him in return. Morning came slowly, peeling away the storm's darkness in thin gray layers. Rain still whispered against the roof, gentler now, more like a presence than a force. The windows of Nathan's shack were streaked with salt and water, and the wind had dropped to a restless murmur. The world felt soaked through, as if the land itself had been turned inside out. Nathan sat at the edge of his bed, still dressed in the same clothes he had worn through the night, boots on, shoulders slumped, the tang of damp canvas and old coffee clinging to him. His eyes were bloodshot, not from drink, but from the war of thought that had raged in his mind until dawn. The flash drive lay on the table beside the lamp, still smudged with grit. The documents he had seen, those lists of shipments, code words, the video footage of men shouting orders over the noise of wind, had looped in his head endlessly, crowding out reason. He had tried to sleep, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw the grainy frame of the stenciled container and the sharp, frozen moment before the screen went black. The name Grayson came back again and again, not as a fact, but as a question. Who was he? Why had he taken this information with him? And what had he hoped would happen to it? Nathan walked into the kitchen and poured himself water. It tasted flat. The glass trembled slightly in his hand. The rum he had added to his coffee the night before still sat on the shelf, half empty, but he ignored it. He needed clarity, not warmth. Through the window, he saw that the tide was already out. The storm had rearranged the beach again. Sandbanks had shifted, logs had rolled far inland, and a section of fencing from a nearby dock lay shattered near the footpath. He opened the back door and stepped out into the chill. The sky above was an uneven blanket of cloud, pale and broken, light shifting across it like breath behind thin fabric. A few birds called lazily across the dunes. Everything felt washed out. He walked to the dune ridge and crouched low, his eyes sweeping the trail down to the beach. The footprints from the night before were gone, erased by wind and water. But the memory of those eyes staring back at him through the rain still hung like a shadow behind his ribs. He didn't need to see prints to know he was being watched. The feeling didn't leave. It hadn't for days. Back inside, Nathan unwrapped the damp canvas and took out the manifest. He flipped through the sheets, studying the column of names. Grayson's among them. Several others were circled or marked with an asterisk. What caught his attention now was a set of codes in the margin, hastily handwritten, as if added at the last moment. He wondered if these were access credentials, instructions, or warnings. The numbers weren't dates, at least not obviously. He reached for the metal lockbox again, hoping the power held. The keypad still worked, blinking faintly. He tried the new codes. The box didn't open. It already had, but he was curious whether the system might contain another layer. Nothing. He sat back and rubbed his eyes. He didn't know what he was looking for anymore. Answers, maybe, direction, or just the end of this slow, suffocating uncertainty. Later that morning, Nathan walked into town. The streets were slick with runoff, the gutters clogged with seaweed and bits of trash. The storm had peeled paint from signs and left shingles scattered across porches. At the harbor, a few men were pulling nets out of the water, their movements slower than usual, like everything had been dulled by what the storm had left behind. He passed the general store, then crossed to the sheriff's station on the edge of the square. The building was squat and nondescript, a leftover from another era. He stood across the street for several minutes, staring at the front door. Through the glass, he could see a man inside, broad-shouldered in uniform, leaning over a desk, talking to someone out of sight. Nathan's mouth went dry. He took a step forward, but then froze. On the wall inside, beside the sheriff's bulletin board, hung a framed photograph of community events, a few officers shaking hands with out-of-town guests. One of the faces in the photograph stopped Nathan cold, the man from the SUV, clean-shaven, pale-eyed, with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. In the photo, he wore no jacket, no gun, just a blazer and a tag that read Regional Consultant Coastal Security Task Force. Nathan turned away. He walked briskly, hands in his pockets, not looking back. His heart pounded with a slow, hard rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion. Whatever this was, it went deeper than old wreckage and buried cargo. The man in the SUV wasn't an outsider. He had connections here. Maybe had them all along. By the time Nathan returned home, the sky had begun to clear in ragged patches, sunlight breaking through in weak shafts that made the wet sand glisten. But inside him, the weight only grew heavier. His thoughts felt sharper now, angrier, like driftwood drying after a storm. The dream of keeping the case hidden until he could figure it out was gone. Someone else already knew. Someone powerful enough to stand in a sheriff's office and smile for the camera. In the small front room of his shack, Nathan sat at the table and opened a leather-bound logbook, his fishing ledger, old and weathered, filled with handwritten notes, weather patterns, and observations about the tides. It had been his father's once. Nathan flipped to the back, where he had long ago used the blank pages to jot down odd things, reminders, thoughts, scraps of poetry he never shared. He took a pen and began to write. Not everything, not yet, but enough. He described the case, the documents, the names. He recorded the codes from the margin, the contents of the flash drive, the timestamp on the video. He wasn't sure who he was writing it for. Maybe for himself, maybe for whoever found the shack if he disappeared. But the act of writing calmed him. It turned chaos into lines and sentences. It gave the storm a voice. When he finished, he tore out the page, folded it neatly, and slid it into a sealed envelope. On the front, he wrote a name, Everett Langston. Everett was an old friend of his father's, now a retired Marine radio operator living 2 towns north. The man didn't trust officials, didn't use cell phones, and had once told Nathan that secrets sent over water traveled straighter than those sent over wires. He stepped outside and walked to the mailbox, but paused. If he mailed it here, it might never leave the post office. Instead, he turned and walked down the beach until he reached a stretch of shoreline far from the public path. There, he buried the envelope beneath a flat stone near the base of a weathered dune, the same place he used to hide spare keys. It would wait there, quietly, until he needed to retrieve it, or until someone else did. That night, Nathan couldn't eat. He heated a tin of soup, but left it untouched. The wind had returned, not fierce, but full of teeth. The shutters clicked against their hinges, and the firewood snapped loudly in the stove. He kept the lights low and the flash drive on a string around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. Near midnight, he heard the sound again, tires on sand, slow and deliberate. He rose and moved to the window. The SUV. It stopped at the foot of the trail, same as before, but this time no one stepped out. The engine idled, lights off. Nathan stood there in the dark, heart thudding, fingers curled around the edge of the curtain. After several minutes, the engine revved once, then the vehicle backed away and vanished down the road. He didn't sleep. He sat up until dawn, the flash drive in his hand, watching the window as the sky lightened and the tide returned once again to wash the world clean. In the morning, he made his decision. He would not give the case to the sheriff. He would not give it to men in suits pretending to be helpful. He would go straight to someone who could expose the truth, someone outside this town, outside its politics. Maybe a journalist. Maybe a sailor with nothing left to lose. He didn't know yet. But the moment had passed for silence. He began packing a small bag, just enough for one night. The flash drive, the original papers, the negatives. The rest he buried in the same place as the envelope. The case itself he would take with him, hidden in a tarp, under fishnets, as if it were a part of his usual gear. The sea had brought this story to him, and now, perhaps, it was the sea that could help him carry it where it needed to go. He glanced at the framed photo of his son on the shelf, sunburned and smiling on the day they had gone fishing before everything changed. Nathan nodded to the boy in the picture. "I'll do this right," he said aloud, his voice rough with mourning. The sea murmured in reply, distant and steady, as if it had been waiting all along for him to choose. Nathan waited until the sky turned that familiar greenish-gray, the way it always did before a real storm, not a passing squall, but the kind of weather that shifted the coastline and left behind new maps in sand and water. The wind had changed again, coming in harder off the water, whistling through the eaves of the shack like a warning. Clouds layered over the sea like slate shingles, heavy and uneven, and the gulls had vanished. He'd lived too long by the ocean not to recognize the signs. It was coming, and it would be brutal. He had made his choice the day before, or maybe it had been decided for him the moment he pulled that silver case from the wet sand. There was no more time for hesitation. Whoever was watching him wasn't going to wait much longer. The way the SUV had lingered at the base of the dune, headlights off, engine rumbling low, it hadn't been curiosity. It had been calculation. And the man he'd seen in the sheriff's office photo, smiling, comfortable, tied into something far deeper than a missing shipping manifest, wasn't going to let the contents of that flash drive slip away quietly. Inside the shack, Nathan moved methodically, packing the last of what he needed. The flash drive, now on a leather cord around his neck, rested flat against his chest beneath his shirt. The small pile of documents, the manifests, the list of names, the photo negatives, he wrapped in waxed cloth and sealed with string, then tucked it into the bottom of a canvas duffel. The silver case itself, its latches secured and outer surface rubbed clean of salt crust, he wrapped tightly in tarps and netting. It looked, from a distance, like nothing more than a bundle of crab pots or old tackle. He stepped outside, dragging the bundle behind him in the cart he used for hauling gear to the boat. The wheels creaked against the sand, the wind pushing at his back. As he climbed the trail over the dune, he paused once to look out over the water. The sea looked angry already. Long swells rolled in from the horizon, whitecaps feathering their edges. Far out, the sky and water blurred together in a smear of steel and cloud. No one else was on the beach. The entire stretch of shore was his and the ocean's alone. Down at the dock, his boat rocked harder than usual against its moorings. The boards groaned underfoot as he moved, but he'd reinforced them last season, and they held. The boat was old, battered from years of salt and storms, but still seaworthy. He checked the engine, tightened the ropes, and stowed the bundle beneath the bench at the stern. Above, the clouds lowered like a lid. The world was holding its breath. As he untied the moorings and started the engine, he scanned the shoreline one last time. His shack, tucked behind the dunes, was barely visible now, a small smudge of weathered wood against the sand. He didn't expect to see it again. Whatever happened today, that part of his life was done. Whether he returned or not, the man who had lived there, the quiet fisherman who kept to himself and trusted no one, was already gone. The motor caught with a coughing growl, and he guided the boat away from the dock, the bow nosing into the rising chop. The wind slapped at his face, sharper now, stinging with salt. The water deepened from brown and blue to near black as he moved farther out, the shoreline shrinking behind him. He kept his hand steady on the tiller, eyes scanning the horizon, the motion as natural as breathing. This part he knew. The open sea was where he had always been most himself. He navigated toward a series of submerged rocks about a mile offshore, a place where the current split and eddied, a natural trench that the locals knew to avoid unless they were dropping traps. It was deep, unpredictable, and almost always deserted. Perfect. He slowed the engine and dropped anchor. The boat swung slightly with the wind. He pulled the tarp-wrapped bundle from under the bench and placed it carefully in the center of the deck. The latches were still sealed, the metal cold through the layers. His hands lingered on it for a moment. There was a strange sadness in the act. He had spent days consumed by this thing, haunted by it, hunted because of it, and now he was about to give it back to the sea. But it wasn't the information that mattered most. That part was safe. The flash drive was with him. The case itself, its weight, its history, that needed to be removed from the game. He took the lead weights from under the seat, the ones he normally used to sink old lobster traps, and strapped them tightly to the bundle with nylon cord. The extra mass would ensure it didn't float, even if someone tracked him. Even if they saw him out here from the shore, they wouldn't be able to retrieve it. As he worked, thunder rumbled in the distance, low and constant. The first drops of rain hit his shoulders like stones. He stood at the edge of the boat, cradling the bundle in both arms. The ocean rolled beneath him, endless and indifferent. He let it go. The splash was loud in the silence, louder than he expected. The case vanished instantly into the water, pulled down by the weights, leaving behind only a widening circle of ripples. Nathan stood there, watching the sea close over it. The wind whipped his coat, the rain now steady. Somewhere beneath him in the shifting dark, the ocean took it back. But he wasn't done. He turned the boat and headed for the rocks near a small inlet he remembered from his younger days. It was hard to find, half concealed behind a jagged outcrop, accessible only at certain tides. Years ago, he and his son had once anchored there to avoid a sudden squall. It had seemed like a hiding place then. It still was. He reached the narrow passage and guided the boat into the inlet. The water was calmer here, shielded from the full force of the storm, but the wind still moaned through the rocks like a warning. He killed the engine and tied off to a stone cleft. Then he took the wax-sealed bundle of documents and flash drives and placed them in a dry bag. From his pack, he pulled a bottle, a thick green glass bottle he'd found after a hurricane 5 years earlier, and had kept for no reason he could explain. He slipped the flash drive and one of the negatives inside, then sealed it with melted wax and wrapped it in canvas. The note he'd written the day before, the one he had buried near the dune, he now copied again by hand and rolled into a second bottle. He placed both inside an old crab trap and secured the lid. Then he lowered the trap gently into the water at the edge of the rocks, weighting it just enough so it would sink, but not too deep. If the tide shifted right, the current would carry it along the shore toward the next town north, where Everett Langston lived. He stood there for a long moment, the trap gone from view, the water calming again. He had done what he could. The evidence would travel now, out of his hands. If Everett found it, and if Everett still had the will to raise hell the way he used to, then maybe the story would survive. Maybe the truth would reach the surface. Maybe Grayson's name would mean something again. He climbed back into the boat and started the engine. As he turned to leave the inlet, movement on the horizon caught his eye. A dark shape. A boat. Larger than his, sleek and fast, cutting across the water from the direction of the harbor. Nathan's jaw clenched. It was them. He throttled up, pushing the engine harder than he usually dared. The old motor roared, and the bow lifted as he surged forward into open water. The wind howled around him now, the rain lashing in horizontal sheets. Behind him, the other boat accelerated. He didn't think. He just moved. He steered not toward the shore, but farther out, deeper into the sea. He knew these waters better than anyone. He knew where the shoals were, where the hidden rocks lurked just beneath the surface. If he could draw them into unfamiliar territory, maybe he could buy time. Maybe he could make them think he had the case still, that he was trying to flee with it. The chase lasted 10 minutes, maybe less, but it felt like hours. The storm bore down in full now, thunder cracking overhead, waves rising like fists. Nathan's boat leapt and slammed, water crashing over the bow. The pursuing craft gained slowly, its engine newer, its hull sharper through the water. Then, through the rain, Nathan saw it. The outcropping near Deadman's Teeth, a jagged reef that split the sea in two. He veered hard, cutting into the narrow channel he'd used only once before. His boat slipped through, barely missing the rocks. The other vessel followed. There was a screech of metal, a sudden plume of spray, and a crack like lightning hitting stone. Nathan looked back just in time to see the bow of the pursuing craft shudder and lift, scraping hard against the reef. The hull jerked sideways, stalled, and the motor sputtered into silence. One of the men on board stood at the bow, gesturing furiously, but the other was trying to restart the engine. The current had them now, pulling them sideways. Nathan didn't wait to see more. He looped wide around the far edge of the reef and turned back toward shore. The wind still howled and the rain still poured, but he felt a strange calm settle over him. The silver case was gone, buried in the cold dark. The evidence had been cast into the current, carried toward someone who might understand. And the men who hunted him were trapped behind him, mired in a place only the sea knew how to punish. By the time he reached the harbor, the sky had begun to lighten behind the clouds. The storm still raged, but its heart had passed. He tied off at the far end of the dock behind a rusted fishing barge and slipped away through the shadows. No one saw him return. His shack was empty when he entered, and he sat at the table, dripping, exhausted, the storm still whispering against the windows. For the first time in days, he felt no fear, only silence. The sea had taken back what it wanted, but it had left him something else. Resolve, a name, and a voice inside that said the story wasn't over yet. The following weeks passed in a strange blur, the memory of the storm and the chase blending with everyday life, yet leaving Nathan's mind restless. He returned to his routine on the water, tending nets and checking traps, repairing his small boat and mending sails. But the normal rhythms of fishing could not drown the constant hum of what had happened. The ocean, once a source of calm and predictability, had become a keeper of secrets. Every wave that broke against the dock seemed to carry whispers, the pulse of something vast and older than the town itself. Nathan moved through his days with a quiet alertness, every glance toward the horizon reminding him of the silver case sinking beneath the surface, and the trap with the flash drive and documents sent into the current toward Everett Langston. The knowledge that the evidence was now traveling without him was both a relief and a weight he could not place aside. The town had returned to a semblance of normalcy, or at least as much as a small coastal village could after the storm. Fishermen repaired their boats, the market reopened, and children ran along the shore collecting debris for fires. Nathan, however, moved among them with a certain distance, careful not to attract attention. The incident had changed him, and he knew it. He avoided the old dockside cafe where locals gathered because he couldn't bear casual conversation about what had washed ashore. They might have spoken of driftwood and lost crates, but the truth of the case, of what he now carried in memory, could not be shared with anyone, not yet, not ever, unless the right hands came along. One morning, weeks later, Nathan received a signal that the ocean's currents had done their work. He was at the far end of the beach, checking traps, when a small vessel appeared at the horizon, moving slowly, purposefully. It was a commercial trawler, unusual for this stretch of water, with nets already deployed. Curious, he watched as the crew pulled in a heavy trap, the kind used for lobsters or crabs, but his eyes were drawn immediately to the green glass bottle that protruded from the tangle of nets. Its seal was intact, its wax slightly softened from the water but otherwise pristine. Nathan's heart thudded in his chest. This was it. The messages, the flash drive, the documents, they had arrived where he had intended. He hurried down to the water's edge, waves lapping against his boots, and helped guide the trap safely to shore. The crew, seeing his approach, waved him back initially, but Nathan's familiarity with the beach and the handling of the net quickly earned their reluctant cooperation. Together, they lifted the contents onto the sand. Nathan carefully removed the bottle from the trap, checking it for any damage. The wax was intact, the cord secure. He pried open the seal with his knife, extracting the rolled papers and the flash drive. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight of the situation lift slightly. The evidence was no longer entirely in his hands, yet it was still within reach of those who could act. Nathan examined the notes first. They were precise, a concise retelling of the manifest, the codes, the names, and the obscure references to restricted cargo. Everett Langston's name appeared on the document, along with coordinates and instructions for further handling. Nathan ran his fingers over the paper, feeling the indentation of each word, each stroke of the pen. It was a direct line from the past to the present, from the sunken Myron to the shore, to him. The flash drive went into the laptop he had brought along. The device whirred to life instantly, the files opening as they had before. But now, with the documents back in his sight and the location known, Nathan began to see the bigger picture. The manifests, the video footage, and the written logs all fit together. The restricted cargo had been government property, mixed with shipments that were officially unremarkable, but the coded messages, the hidden paperwork, and the names suggested someone on the ship had tried to hide evidence of wrongdoing. Nathan could see it now. Grayson had taken the flash drive and documents intending to protect or expose them, but fate, or the storm, had intervened. The sea had carried them to Everett Langston, a man whose reputation for integrity was known in a few circles, though mostly he kept to himself in the next town over. Nathan felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The evidence was moving into responsible hands, but the consequences of its discovery were unpredictable. What would happen if the names were traced? What power structures would be disrupted? Would lives be put at risk? Nathan's hands tightened around the edge of the laptop. He had done what he could. The rest was out of his control. Over the next several days, Nathan observed from a distance as activity began to increase. Investigative journalists, prompted by the materials he had helped deliver, started asking questions. Tracked through maritime channels, the flash drive's contents revealed layers of old mismanagement, corruption, and smuggling operations long buried by time and bureaucratic inertia. Reports emerged slowly, at first in small local newspapers, then gradually reaching broader audiences. The town murmured with curiosity and gossip, though the depth of what had been uncovered remained opaque to most residents. Nathan watched the ebb and flow of attention from the safety of his home, his old boat tied up at the dock, the sea stretching vast and indifferent before him. Despite the rise in awareness, no one knew Nathan's role. He moved among the villagers, seen but not recognized, a shadow in the daylight. Yet, even in his invisibility, he felt a strange sense of closure. The case, the storm, the chase, the danger, they had passed. The ocean had reclaimed its secret, but in doing so, it had allowed truth to surface. Nathan took long walks along the beach, retracing the paths he had walked during those tense days, observing the sand for patterns, the tide for signs, the gulls for any disruption. He thought about Grayson, a man whose actions had been carried silently beneath decades of waves, whose courage had created ripples that Nathan had been fortunate, or unfortunate, enough to follow. One afternoon, he met Everett Langston in person for the first time. The meeting was brief and understated, nothing more than two men acknowledging the journey the evidence had taken. Langston had handled the material with precision and discretion, contacting the necessary authorities while safeguarding lives and ensuring accountability. Nathan felt an unfamiliar warmth in the handshake, a recognition that the course he had set in motion, with all its risk and moral weight, had led to something meaningful. The two men shared few words, but the understanding between them was complete. They had been witnesses to history in motion, and while neither could alter the past, they had influenced its resolution. In the weeks that followed, Nathan returned to his solitary life on the coast. The harbor hummed with normal activity once more, boats creaking in the sun, gulls circling, tides ebbing and flowing. Yet the knowledge of what had passed lingered. The flash drive, the papers, the memories of chasing shadows across sand and through rain. They remained with him, a quiet reminder that life could shift on the turn of a tide, that decisions taken in secrecy could ripple outward in ways unimaginable. He spent his days on the water, working nets, repairing lines, checking traps, and occasionally glancing at the horizon, imagining the currents carrying secrets, evidence and stories to unknown destinations. Months later, a reporter arrived in the town to follow up on the investigation, seeking context and witnesses. Nathan watched from a distance as interviews were conducted. People recounted fragments of the storm and the items it had brought ashore. Yet Nathan said nothing. His role was invisible, but the satisfaction of having preserved the integrity of the evidence, of having seen it reach the right hands, settled deep in his chest. In the evenings, he walked the beach, the wind tangling in his hair, the sun setting over the water in long streaks of gold and purple. He imagined Grayson somewhere, watching or remembering, a man long gone but whose courage had traveled decades to reach him. Nathan thought about the future, uncertain but strangely lighter. The ocean had given him a story, had tested him, had taken the burden away in its own time. He would return to the water again and again, as he always had. The sea, eternal and indifferent, held its mysteries close, yet occasionally released one into the hands of those willing to take responsibility for it. Nathan walked slowly, the sand cold beneath his boots, listening to the surf, knowing he had done what he could. The evidence would now find its own course, the truth moving outward like ripples across the tide. And somewhere, far away, a name from decades past would finally have its voice heard, carried on the waves that never forget and never forgive. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the final light over the calm waters. Nathan stopped and looked out across the open sea. It was vast, limitless, and unforgiving, yet it had given him closure, a measure of peace. The weight of the storm and the silver case had finally lifted. He turned back towards the town, toward his small shack at the edge of the dunes, knowing that the sea, in its eternal patience, had done its work, and that he had been a part of something larger than himself, a witness and a keeper, until the currents carried the story beyond reach. And as the waves broke along the shore, soft and persistent, Nathan understood the truth that had guided him through the fear, the danger, and the storm. Sometimes the sea gives back what it has taken, and sometimes the smallest actions ripple farther than the mind can measure, leaving echoes that travel across years, across towns, and across generations, carrying with them the quiet power of integrity, courage, and patience. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next thrilling adventure. There's plenty more mysteries, shocking discoveries, and life-changing secrets waiting for you in our upcoming videos. Don't forget to watch our other videos and see what unbelievable stories the sea and the world has in store. And if this story gave you chills, make sure to share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on the action.